Hello everyone! This is Naerina from 40k Theories, and welcome to the May 2024 edition of the Patreon Q&A sessions. Unfortunately, Remlace was unable to record the audio for this video, but he has answered your questions. I just happened to be reading his answers out loud. If I have any takes of my own, I'll let you know too. As always, if you'd like your questions answered, then click the link in the video description below and help support the channel by becoming a patron. Now, let's jump into the questions. Austin Horner asks, are there any instances of a mortal Eldar wielding the wailing doom? And if so, did it have a similar effect on them as the Widowmaker in fantasy? And Remlace answers, not to my knowledge, no. The closest instance that comes to mind is whenever an Eldari becomes the quote-unquote young king, as they are given the wailing doom before being sent into the chamber of the Avatar. But aside from that, none come to mind. Given that a group of Eldar were able to launch an assault on Nurgle's garden after their craft world had come under attack by a host of Nurgle in a desperate attempt to free Isha to save their craft world, fighting for days on end before finally being turned into trees within the garden when their physical bodies had fully rotted away, is it possible that the Eldar could effectively hide from Slaanesh within the realms of the other gods, as Slaanesh never claimed the Eldar's souls despite them being fully immersed in the warp and were using their psychic powers without restraint? And Remlace answers, possibly, but even then they'd probably be targeted by the other gods, given that an Eldari's soul is like a big, glowing beacon. Even if Slaanesh can't get to it, another god and or its demons will most certainly try. Spoilers for Lazarus, Enmity's Edge. During the epilogue, the Fifth Company is recalled to the Rock on the orders of the Lion. Do you think this means we shall be getting a book covering the Lion's return to the Rock soon? And Remlace answers, hopefully. But personally, I'd rather have a book focusing on Gilliman and Lion's reunion. And from, my own perspective, I hope so. And yeah, I think I'd also prefer the kind of reunion book, or at least having a book in which this reunion happens, but yeah, sounds intriguing. Mike Murdoch asks, with the story of the female Adeptus Custodes now out there thanks to the upcoming codex, do you think it will open the door for more female Custodes and possible female Space Marines, or will it just stay in the Custodes? Remlace answers, well, there's at least 2 to 3 mentioned in the codex already, so that's a given. As for female Space Marines, it's hard to say given that the creation process for both is so radically different. Like with the Custodes, the process was always vague enough to easily retcon it to be compatible with both men and women, since it was basically magic, literally being described as biological alchemy. Seeing as how the process works with men and women, and how long it takes to make a custodian, you could argue that the process to make them is, frankly, perfect, especially when compared to the cruder, more mass-produced Space Marines. So, at this current time, I don't think the female Astartes will necessarily become a thing yet. And from my own point of view, yeah, I have nothing to add. He said it perfectly. In the Farsight story in the Arcs of Omen, do you feel he will have the willpower to resist the temptation of the Chaos if it starts to Khorne wanting him as a champion? Remlace answers, well, he resisted the temptations of Chaos upon gazing into the realm of Chaos back on Earth as Moloch, originally at least. We did a video a few years back about Farsight potentially falling to Chaos, so check that out. Pentadeus asks, if a loyalist chapter of Space Marines was found to have stable gene seed, but lacking several Space Marine organs, 5 or more, what would happen? And Remlace replies, realistically it depends entirely on what organs are missing. If it is the ones for muscle and bone growth, for instance, then it most certainly won't be viable enough to use at all. If a gene seed is found to have degraded that much during their routine purity checks, so as to have lost so many organs, they'll probably be deemed damaged goods by the administratum and purged. Are you feeling better today than yesterday? And Remlace answers, lol. Alright. And Naerina, continues, yeah, lol. Zero Hits asks, Traitor Marines must have their own small empires to harvest and produce the resources they need to continue their wars. Are there any stories that feature these places? And Remlace answers, Yes. Off the top of my head, this scenario is briefly touched upon in the Beast Rises series, as the orcs lay siege to a number of worlds which are used by the Iron Warriors. Brandon A. asks, a follow-up question about Malice having his own champion in being anti-chaos or chaos. Would you say that he would use a long-range weapon to deny a Khornate warrior a melee fight and using a heavy flamer against creatures of Nurgle? Remlace answers, not necessarily. It would depend entirely on the champion's own fighting style. Does the Imperium make use of neutral warp-born creatures, say familiars? Remlace answers, as a whole, no. Do certain radical elements within the Inquisition? Probably. And from the point of view of an inquisitorial interrogator, can I get one? How many Marines can there be to be allowed to rebuild their chapter after almost being wiped out? 50? 100? Remlace answers, as few as 0. A chapter can be wiped out entirely and then re-established. See, for example, the Imperial Fists, Emperor's Swords, and Soul Drinkers. Richard Martin asks, what do you think of the Leagues of Votann? And Remlace answers, yeah, I think they're pretty cool. And Naerina shares this vision. They're pretty cool. Can you go into why Betrayer is your favorite? Remlace answers, a combination of pacing, action, character development, and the fact it's just an all-around well-written and entertaining book. How do Sisters of Battle interact or view the normal human citizens? And Remlace answers, it honestly depends on the order in question, as some are more zealous or fanatical than others, and thus will treat people differently depending on how pious they are. Voice of the Emperor asks, can you possibly list the non-demonic diseases in Warhammer, or is that list longer than Tzeentch's diary? Remlace answers, all of them? No, there's at least a dozen from Katagan alone, such as I rot. A-Dog asks, if sanguinary priests inject the blood of Sanguinius, and they've been doing that for millennia, how does Sanguinius' corpse still have blood? And Remlace answers, the sanguinary priests do not obtain Sanguinius' blood from his corpse, but the Red Grail, which is an artifact that was filled with his blood in an effort to preserve it after his body was retrieved from the vengeful spirit. The blood from the Grail is then injected into the priests, and eventually, quote-unquote, bled back into the Grail in order to keep it fresh and stop it from clotting to fuck and becoming, well, dead, essentially. And that concludes this edition of the Patreon Q&A sessions. As always, if you'd like your questions answered, then click the link in the video description below and help support the channel by becoming a patron. Until next time, this has been Naerina from 40k Theories, and we'll see you again soon. Bye bye!